learning here about the laws of well, a number of different laws of different things that are kosher for schach and non-kosher for schach. And basically, one of the things that we were dealing with was material that's like what is called susceptible to tuma. And what we found out yesterday was that something that's potentially usable for susceptible to tumas saras, leprosy, that's also called a susceptible to tuma. In other words, like a thread or garment. That would be these things would be considered. Well, a garment is not so surprising to us that it's susceptible to tuma, but thread, that would be something surprising. That at least seems a little surprising that it would be susceptible to tuma, just because it can receive a tumas negoim tsaras. It can get a certain spot, a red spot or a green spot or something, on the garment, and it becomes tame. Not, we wouldn't necessarily think that that's the rule that we're talking about here in the laws of Sukkah. Sukkah generally, I mean, the general laws of Tumah, you would think have to do with someone touched the dead body and then they touched this. You would think that that's the laws of Tumah, susceptible to Tumah, things like that. And here we're talking about even if it's susceptible to Tumas Tzaras, that's also called susceptible to Tumah. That's what we did see. Now, while we're talking
Rabbi,
yes.
Yes. Would schach itself be susceptible to tuma?
No, so that's what we're talking about. That schach is not allowed to be susceptible to tuma. If it's that's our Mishnah, right? We was that klal, the rule in the Mishnah, the two main rules of schach, where it has to grow from the ground and it can't be susceptible to tuma. But what does that mean, susceptible to tuma? So what we saw yesterday was that the susceptible to tuma even means tumas tzaras. Now,
so even with real schach,
of course, every schach is what is schach? Schach has to be something that's not susceptible to tumah. Now, for practical purposes, what that means is a finished product. A finished product. That's why schach is always unfinished. It's a branch. It's something that's unfinished. A finished product would not be. You can't use a table for schach. You know what I mean? Anything that's something that's finished is generally something susceptible to tumah. So this is the point that we were making was that we saw from Rabba Bar Chana in the name of Rabbi Yochanan was about using pishtan, flax, which grows from the ground, but at a certain stage it's called processed. Now, the fact that it's processed itself would not make it susceptible to tumah, because it's hardly usable for any. It's hardly a vessel. It's not a garment even. But actually, the laws of tumas tzaras apply to thread. That the thread is already something called susceptible to tumah, because it's usable because it's potentially going to be could have leprosy on it. Now, how far do we go? So we know if it's unsoaked, that's for sure not considered finished. It's not considered thread. So the term that the Gemara used was hutzne pishton, which is basically you just harvested it. You just cut it from the ground, this flax, and you didn't do anything with it. You didn't even soak it and wash it. That is definitely kshera for schach, is kosher for schach. It grows from the ground. What's wrong? But then you have all the series of processing that's done. You have soaking, and then they beat it, and then they wash it, they dry it. Well, I guess after the soaking they dry it, and then they beat it, and then they have to comb it. And then they make it, spin it into thread. So the Gemara had a question of what Rabbi Yochanan had a question, what the law is with this middle stage of Hushne Pishtan. And then Rabba Bar Chana had a question, and I'm not sure what Rabbi Yochanan considered this middle stage, because there's two middle stages. So he says, is Rabbi Yochanan's case where he questions it, is that a case where it's the more advanced case, the more processed case, or is his case of question very inclusive of both situations where it's the Gemara's term is either it's diyek or dayek v'loy nafetz. Dayek means that it's a beaten, but it's not combed. Is that the only case where the case of question, or is this case of question if it's soaked and you didn't even beat it yet? If that's also a case of question, because once you soak it, maybe that would be included in this law of it's makabel tumah. Now, why would it be makabel tumah at this stage? I mean, it is a little, it's somewhat far from being ready to be spun into thread. So, where do you come up with this idea that it could be makabel tumah? So the commentaries all debate this. This is a subject of a serious debate. In fact, Rabbeinu Tam wants to learn that it actually means that there are bundles of the case of anitze. What is the case of anitze pishta? So it's combed flax. Anitze pishtan is combed flax. It's not made into thread. So even anitze pishtan here is sort of questionable. Like, it's not thread yet. Why should it be subject to tuma? It's bundles of combed flax. Now, if it would be spun, then fine. So Rabbeinu Tam wants to say that these bundles are not just they're not just combed flax; they're actually spun already. That's the way Rabbeinu Tam wants to learn. The other commentaries, even Tosfos himself, doesn't agree with that, and they come up with different ways of explaining this. Either because it's right before the stage of spinning it into thread, that's why it would be considered subject to Tumas Negoyim, maybe rabbinically, or because it's no longer looks like the product from the ground. That would be a reason that it would be considered something that you cannot use for schach psula. It would be puzzled because it does not look like it's from the ground. It looks too processed. So these are different commentaries how they want to learn. But Rashi seems to understand that this is this is a problem of it's subject to tuma. The way Rashi wants to learn seems to be very simple, that this is a case, it's fit to be tame for negoyim. It doesn't go into this, how could it be that it's unspun, that it could be subject to tuma. So what comes out is that Rashi learns that this is a biblical issue. According to the other commentaries, it comes out that it's a rabbinic issue. So if we pull up Shulchan Aruch here, it does create a difference of halacha because of these the difference with regard to the cases of question. Is it suffix d'oraisa or is it a suffix d'rabbanan? When you have the cases of question, those cases question of rabbinic law or question of biblical law. So in chapter 629, so it says Sikhacha bepishtan. The Machaber Rabbi Yosef Cairo writes, if you used pishtan flax for schach, kishaloi nidek v'loi nipetz, it wasn't combed and the uh, the it was soaked and it wasn't beaten and it wasn't combed. So what does the Mechaber say? Keshera, it is considered kosher. The eitz bialmahu, it is just wood. Avalim nidek v'nipates, but if it was beaten and combed, psula, it would be invalid. So nidek v'nipates, that would be the case that our Gemara says, where it's not kosher for schach. Nite pishton, it was even combed. That would be psula. In the case where it's kosher, is loy nidek v'loy nipates. It was loy nidek v'loy nipates, meaning it wasn't beaten and it wasn't combed. Then it's kosher. What about the middle case? Leaves it out. If it was beaten but not combed. But what about this first case, where it was soaked, but it was not beaten or combed? So it was soaked already. Now, what did our Gemara say? Our Gemara said that if it was soaked, tari, v'loy diek, if it was soaked, but it was not beaten, our Gemara has a suffix that might be considered hushni, where it's a suffix, where Rabbi Yochanan wasn't sure. So our Gemara makes that case a suffix, and the Shulchan Aruch says that case is kosher. So it sounds like that would be a case that we're following the other opinions, not Rashi. So according to Rashi, seemingly that would be a case of suffix d'oraisa l'chumra. I'm just throwing that thought there. Now let's see the Mishnah Brura. So Mishnah Brura says that it was soaked. Nevertheless, it wasn't beaten. It's considered eitz. What would happen if it would be beaten but not combed, which is the case that the Shulchan Aruch leaves out? It doesn't mention that middle case. So he says that would be puzzle. That would be invalid. Umisayf devarav mashma, the nidek v'nipates be'inon, aval nidek l'chod loy. So he leaves out the middle case from the initially it sounds like maybe that would be invalid. At the end, it sounds like only that the other case is invalid. This case should be valid. So, so the Mishnah Brura says, he brings from other commentaries that that seems like they want to be lenient. The Shulchan Aruch left out that case. So the commentaries, the Prisha, the Biur Hagara, they want to say, nevertheless, he says, even if it was soaked, you should only use it in a case where it's b'makam hadachak, in a place where it's necessary. So even though the Shulchan Aruch says this case is kosher, keshera, the Mishnah Brura paskins a little differently than the Shulchan Aruch that says this is only when it's b'makam hadachak, in a place of necessity. And then he says, what would be the reason why nidek v'nipates is invalid? So in that case, he says that's rabbinic because it doesn't look like it grows from the ground, and also it's something that is fit to put into pillows, and then it would be susceptible to tumah, and therefore he says also like little pieces of this you shouldn't use because it's also fit to put into pillows, and even if it wasn't he says according to these reasons, he says even cotton and canvas that are not metame bin agoyim, they aren't susceptible to tumas negoyim, the tuma of saras, if it was nidek beaten and nipates and combed, you shouldn't use it for the same reason, because it's fit to use for parim and kasasos. It's fit to use for pillows, which would not nothing to do with tumas negoyim. It would be tuma because it's like a kli. And then he says, and also he says a reason that since it's ready to be spun, and it will then be susceptible to tuma. Therefore, they made a gzeira not to use it for schach. He says, according to that, if it's cotton or canvas that doesn't fall into that category because it's not makabel tuma, then you wouldn't have such a gzeira. So he says, based on the different reasons, it could apply to other material. In other words, because of the reason of it's close to being made into a pillow, because it's used for pillows, that would be a reason why it's susceptible to tuma, even other materials. But according to the reason that it's close to being spun into thread, so that would only apply to wool and linen. It would not apply to other materials, because the tuma of tsaras only applies to those materials. Anyway, bottom line is, that there seems to be uh, uh, um, it seems to depend somewhat on the different reasons, and seemingly this would also be connected to if it's da'araisa or d'rabbanan, it's biblical or rabbinic. Um, um, on the other hand, it does seem a little surprising. Now, if it's rabbinic, the question would be, so Rabbi Yochanan is not sure about this case. So if it's a Savak Darabanan, we should be lenient. Why is Shulchan Aruch being machmir? Why is Shulchan Aruch saying that in this case you have to be more careful? Or it leaves it out. The Pishtan Kishalei Nidek Lemitz Kshera. Nidek V'nipetz, he says, is puzzle. If it's a daraisa, if it's biblical, so the Shulchan Aruch leaves it out. That's not surprising, I guess, because you have this shiloh, what to do if it's does. It could, according to Rashi, it's biblical. You should be machmir, should be strict. According to the other opinions, it's rabbinic, so you could be lenient. The Shulchan Aruch leaves it out. Now the commentaries say you could be lenient. They're following the other views, but the Mishnah Berurah says better not to be lenient, only in a place of need. Anyway, it would seem like it might be connected to these discussions if it's the Raisa or the Rabbanan. Okay, anyway, that's the Gemara again. I don't know how practical it is, but that's what it says in Shulchan Aruch. It seems to follow the the first view of Rabbi Bar Chana, that if it's the question, the at least the case where Rabbi Bar Chana is not sure of is he has these two options. That his second case was maybe if it's soaked but it's not beaten, maybe that would be prohibited. The Shulchan Aruch says that it's kosher. So it seems that it's following. Well, it's kosher. It's a suffix. So I guess it's kosher because suffix drabanan lekulas. It's a suffix drabanan, you could say. All right. In any event, then we have the next Gemara talked about these Shushay and Shvatzri. And Shushay and Shvatzri, there we had Rabbi Yehuda says you could use for schach, and the other opinion, these are like the leaves of these I think someone said licorice or other types of or like herbs. Abai says shushi you could use, but shvatshvi you can't use. And the reason was because sari rechayu, it's a very sharp odor, and the person's going to leave the sukkah. Now, this is also an interesting law. And of course, there's a discussion in the commentaries here. Obviously, what we're seeing is that there are cases when the Rabbanan set rules. Sometimes you have that it's blanket. It's absolute. The rabbi said this is prohibited, and that's prohibited even after the fact. Even the diavad, even it's not. But then you have these cases where there seems to be some room, at least according to some commentaries, where the rabbis said, we're afraid you're going to leave the sukkah. And that's why we're telling you can't use this. What happens if you did use it and you didn't leave the sukkah? Would that be kosher? So we have cases where we're afraid if you use this schach, it's going to be similar to non-kosher schach. In those cases, we said, you can't, you have to go back and eat again in the sukkah, right? That's one type of rabbinic law. But here we have another type of rabbinic law where, at least according to some commentators, and again, it's not automatic, and it's a big argument. The Rosh, the Rambam, and the Ritva, the Ran, they all discuss this type of case where it's sari rechayu, it has a bad smell, and here you have many different levels of opinion, because basically you have, number one, what does it mean b'diavad? After the fact, it's okay, which is the way the Rosh and the Rambam hold. After the fact, this type of rabbinic law, that it's because of we're afraid you're going to leave the sukkah, that's okay. That's it's after the fact. B'diavad, it's kosher. What does it mean b'diavad? I'll give you two options. One could mean after you built your sukkah. That's called, well, the sukkah's built already. That's one way of saying, well, okay, I built it already, I can use it. Then there's another way of b'diavad. The other way of b'diavad means if I ate in it already on the first night, then I'm okay. But if I just built it, that's not okay to go eat in that sukkah. That's not b'diavad. That's not after the fact. I didn't eat in it yet. I just built it. I could go somewhere else and eat in the other person's sukkah. B'diavad is after I did it. So how far do we take this b'diavad? So here, that's a machlekes, the Rosh and the Rambam. If b'diavad, what b'diavad means even. But they both seem to hold that b'diavad after the fact is kosher. It's acceptable. Then you have the Ritva and the Ran that say no. You can't even b'diavad. This is a rabbinic law that they prohibited. It's invalid rabbinically, and they don't seem to want to give in the case of b'diavad. Now, what about using these things for the walls of the sukkah? They smell. Could you use it for the walls? So the Ramah writes in chapter 630, he says, however, don't make the walls from something that has a bad smell or something that will dry out within the 7 days. So he tells you that, by the way, the same law, is the walls have the same problem, because we're afraid it's going to be a person is going to leave the sukkah. Now, what happens if you did use it for the walls? What happens if you did use it for the schach? If you did use it for the schach, that I just mentioned, the big machlokes, the Rosh, the Rambam, the Ran, the Ritva, they all debate about this and what, after the fact, so on. And the same law would apply to the walls. However, the Pri Megadim writes that after, if it's really awful, the smell is awful, then you might not even fulfill the mitzvah, because it's not a dwelling. It's a teishvu kein taduri. You got to dwell. So if it's just a bad smell is one thing, but if it's like an awful smell, then possible you didn't even even biblically you're not yotze. Um,
Rabbi, when you talk about the mitzvah, is it a mitzvah to eat in the sukkah, or is it a mitzvah to build a sukkah? In other words, let's say you never built a sukkah in your life, but you always went to somebody's sukkah and you ate all your meals there like you're supposed to.
right.
Are you missing out on a mitzvah by not building it yourself?
So there is a discussion about the building of a sukkah if it's a mitzvah. And there's a Gemara in Makkos about it. There's discussion about it. We even had a little discussion here if a person who's like a honorable rabbi, if it should be, if he should involve himself with building his sukkah or not. It was a topic of discussion a little while back. I brought up they had a discussion in halacha in the Shalos Tshuvas Forum, and I'm not sure. I think I remember even seeing it here. Back with my Gemara, he brings a few Shalos Tshuvas Forum, and anyway, there's definitely a mitzvah to build. Now, of course, you fulfill the mitzvah if you eat someone else's sukkah, and uh, and it's okay, it's fine. But they're here. He says the tircha of a Talmud Chacham himself to build the sukkah, the Shilas Chuvas Chavas Yoyer. So uh, he connects it to a story, a case where are you allowed to if a scholar, a great scholar, knows how to play musical instruments, is he allowed to play at a chasana in front of the chassan and kala to be masameach them, or is it below his dignity and he's embarrassing, disgracing the Torah with doing this type of work? And the Chavas Yor writes, Ikar Hadavar, it's really a machlekes Rambam and the Rosh, that the Rambam says that when it comes to returning a lost object, so the Rambam writes he's potter from this mitzvah, and but if he wants, he's allowed to humble himself and be machmir, and he's allowed to. The Rosh says it's usher, it's prohibited for him to go and return it. Imagine you find a pair of underwear in the street. So this Rosh Hashiva goes and he's going to return it to the owner. It's below his dignity. So if he's very humble and he wants to, in the olden days, people only had two pairs of underwear, so he would go and take it and felt bad, so he might. So the Rambam says you're allowed to do that. The Rosh says no, it's below his dignity, and it's usher to be mavaza. So it's usher to be machmer. So the Chavas Yair wants to say the same thing would apply if you have some Rosh Hashiva going and he's going to go start playing guitar, the chasana. It's a little humiliating to the Torah. So at least according to the Rosh, according to the Rambam, he's allowed to be machmer and do it. According to the Rambam, he's allowed. It's a bar mitzvah. According to the Rosh, it's usher. And then he jumps into he says that's why big scholars would go and build the sukkah themselves, even in Rosh Hashanah, public, and so on. And the Maharam himself, the famous Maharam Rothenburg, he himself was Isaac in building the sukkah, even though it's a bizayon to be involved in him hammering nails and so on. And it's the sukkah is a davar shabbat. It's not only a dvar mitzvah. Anyway, he says that he brings also the Gemara that we learned earlier. That's where we mentioned it. That it says chal shem shamayim al hachagiga kach chal shem shamayim al sukkah. So that's what. And then he says even the Rosh, who doesn't allow a scholar to return a pair of underwear, but he would agree that he's allowed to embarrass himself for this because it's a davar shabbat. Then he says, then they bring from the Shevet HaKohasi, which I think is Rav Vosner, I believe. So he writes that this is it's mutter to do it in public, and it's yesh ba mitzvah. Building a sukkah has a mitzvah, and a person should try to do it themselves, and not only to hire a shliach, like it says it's a mitzvah by yoser mibeshlucha, a mitzvah to do it. So the Shevet HaKodesh takes it a step further, saying like it's a there is a mitzvah in building it, and he brings also in the Hamek Shaila from the Shiltais. So I think that's from the Netziv, the Hamek Shaila, that he writes that every yid is mechuyev to build, to make a sukkah. That the mitzvah is also building it. It's not just a hechsher mitzvah. And he brings from Rashi in that Gemara that I was quoting in Makkos that chativas eitzim is not a mitzvah, but the building is a mitzvah. So there is so that's and then he says it's also in the Ramah that they start building it. Might say Yom Kippur to go from one mitzvah to another. So you see building it as a mitzvah, and and he brings from the Kaf HaChaim, which is Yosef. Who is the Kaf HaChaim?
Balagi. Balagi. Yeah.
That it's a mitzvah to make the sukkah biyadai, because mitzvah by Yosef b'shlucha, it's a mitzvah him more than his shliach, and the mitzvah has Yetzias Mitzrayim in it, and if you could do it all yourself, if after yesh lasis is kolas, you should do the schach, all the schach with your hands, because the ikar mitzvah sukkah is the schach, and if you're not able to do all the schach, you should do at least a portion of the schach, and the rest you could give to someone else. Then he brings Divrei Yoel, who is the previous Satmar Rebbe, that.
Rabbi, question.
Of the Anyway, so the Chidad writes about it, Hasidim. Anyway, so that's the story about that building the sukkah. He brings in the end. He says Hasidim and Anshe Maisa, even they were mashtatif, even the building of the walls, and there was a chassid that said that the walls hint to the Shem Havaya, Yud Kei Vav Kei. I don't know what the source is, but he says that he wanted to have a portion even in the walls of the sukkah. Okay, anyway, that's taking it a little far, but all right. Bottom line is, the building of the sukkah is some level of different opinion seems like about the level of the mitzvah, but it's definitely a mitzvah. I think Ezra was first, if I'm not mistaken.
You said in your response to Victor, you started by saying that you brought in the case of whether or not a Talmud Chacham should be able to play an instrument or even be mevaze himself at a chasana.
Right.
So now my question is, if David HaMelech in front of the Sefer Torah can do what he does, and a Chatan and Kala can sit to be like a king and queen on their wedding day, why would anybody not
question that? Right. So I guess that when it comes to the actual bringing the ark, or maybe like or Simchas Torah or something like that, or something that's clearly a divrei kedusha, something that's clearly a davar shebekdusha. I don't think anyone would question that. I think here we're talking about where it's a wedding, and the person's going to be jumping up and down, playing the guitar, and and sort of it's more of a humiliating type of thing, and it's at a wedding. I think that's where it's maybe questionable. But I think you have a good point. In other words, how could he compare it? Oh, did I just lose? Is everyone here? Can you hear me?
No.
We're all here.
We hear you.
He wanted to say that even the Rosh would agree. Even the Rosh will agree that it's okay. Right? What was the story? That now to build a sukkah, or what was his conclusion over there? That therefore mutal of kivan shigama Rosh Maida, that davar shebekdusha is no problem. So I guess when it comes to a wedding, I'm not sure why he wants to say that the Rush might have a problem with it. But
Are they
maybe
try
because it's not
maybe
clearly,
let's sanut? In other words, it looks like he's
it's not clearly a davar shebekdusha. Yeah, along those lines, that maybe because it's not clearly a davar shebekdusha. The problem is it is a big mitzvah, and you got a good point, Ezra, that it's this is clearly like a mitzvah. But I guess what he's saying is, well, the same thing as Hashavas Aveda is a mitzvah. And here we say it's prohibited to do it because it's below his dignity. So a mitzvah won't break it. But he says where it's a davar shebekdusha, that will be a good reason. So building a sukkah is considered a davar shebekdusha. And based on our Gemara, he wanted to say it because our Gemara said it's like a chagiga. So when it's a davar shebekdusha, that would be a reason even the Rush would agree. So I guess you have to differentiate that you're right. The chasana is a mitzvah, but it's not a davar shebekdusha. You wouldn't call it a davar shebekdusha, but a siyum sefer Torah you would call it a davar shebekdusha. Bring the ark into the Beis Hamikdash, into Yushalayim. That would be a davar shebekdusha, and that's what it seems that he would say that the Rush would agree to davar shebekdushas.
It's odd.
So call
It's
the
odd.
marriage something else. Why do you call it kiddushin?
That's what I was just going to say.
Right. I hear. Listen, you could always rely on the Rambam. According to the Rambam, there's no problem. But this is his take in this with this Chavos Yair. We'll have to see if anyone argues. Yeah, that's it's a good question.
And what does the man say? Hareat mekudeshet li. He doesn't say I'm taking you kach. He uses some other verb. He uses mekudeshet, which.
Listen, I hear you, and I like what you're saying, especially because we understand that marriage is such an inyan of kedusha. We don't look at it in any way like it's it's like a necessity of man because of the lowliness of, we look at it as a great davar shebekdusha. One of the greatest mitzvahs is getting married and so on. But nevertheless, I think the where he's coming from is the fact that it's not always presented. Not all weddings are done in the most kedusha-dika way. Sometimes they're playing not such Jewish style music, and the dancing is not 100% always so. So there, it gets a little questionable. In other words, doesn't look like the kedusha part. So you're going to have a Rosh Hashiva coming and playing the music. There could be, that could be an area of question. At least what the Chavos Yair holds would be a machlokes Rambam and Rush, if that's appropriate. But anyway, I hear you. I hear what you're saying. It would be interesting to see what the later poskim say about this Chavos Yair, if they take your side of it and argue with him. Okay, I think we had other questions.
The Macarena spoiled it for everything. That's when all Shiitos said.
What'd you say? Who spoiled it?
The Macarena.
Oh, Macarena.
After
That's the
that,
answer.
all Shiitos said it's not.
Right. Okay. I think Mordechai had a question for a long time. Yes, Mordechai.
Yes. Doesn't it say that during Simchas Beis HaShoev that Talmidei Chachamim used to play instruments and joggle?
Joggle. Right. Which you're correct, but I'm thinking that is also considered like a davar shebekdusha. I mean, it's a carbon, the nisach hamayim. It's all about the pouring of the water. This is a serious kedusha, kodshim. This is an inyan of kedusha. But again, I understand where you're both coming from, and the Rambam's view seems very. Seems or maybe to say this, to return a pair of underwear that it seems like a lot worse than playing music at a wedding. You know what I mean? Like that one is more degrading. You could maybe argue with the Chavos Yair and say it's not really degrading to play music. It's far from returning a pair of underwear. Maybe you could argue with that as well. Okay, Jeff.